The night air over Coyoacan held the particular stillness that settles upon the Valley of Mexico in July, heavy, expectant, scented with jasmine and the distant char of evening cooking fires. It was the 13th of July, 1954, a Tuesday, the kind of night that carries no premonition, no atmospheric warning of what is about to pass into history. Inside the walls of the house at Londres 247, painted in that singular shade of cobalt that had given the residence its name, the rooms had grown quiet. The servants had withdrawn. The nurses had completed their rounds. Somewhere in the dim interior, among the pre-Columbian artifacts and the painted furniture, among the portraits and the medical equipment that had become as permanent as the architecture itself, Frida Kahlo lay in her canopied bed. She was 47 years old. She had been dying, in one sense or another, for most of her life. The Blue House, Casa Azul, had witnessed everything. It had held her childhood, her suffering, her marriages, her affairs, her art. Now it held her final hours, though no one present could have marked the precise moment when breath became absence. The attending physician, Dr. Velasco y Polo, would later record the time of death as approximately 6:30 in the morning of July 14th. The official cause entered into the record was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to the lungs and terminated circulation. It was a plausible conclusion. Frida had been gravely ill for months. A year earlier, surgeons had amputated her right leg below the knee, the final intervention in a lifetime of medical catastrophe that had begun with polio at age 6 and accelerated with the bus accident that had shattered her spine, her pelvis, her right leg, her future, when she was only 18. By the summer of 1954, she had endured more than 30 operations. She moved through her days on morphine, Demerol, and sheer obstinance. And yet, something in the narrative resisted simplicity. The first irregularity was subtle, but unmistakable. No autopsy was performed. The body was transported to the Palace of Fine Arts for a public viewing that drew hundreds of mourners, then taken directly to the crematorium. By nightfall of July 14th, Frida Kahlo had been reduced to IT. The ashes her husband, Diego Rivera, would eventually place in a pre-Columbian urn, shaped like a frog, displayed in the very bedroom where she had died. Rivera himself would later make statements that complicated the clean story of natural death. In the years that followed, he spoke of Frida's final night with a strange, shifting candor. He mentioned her diary, those pages where she had written, in handwriting grown uneven with pain and medication, words that seemed to court an ending. "I hope the exit is joyful," she had written, "and I hope never to return." The nurses reported that on the evening of July 13th, Frida had given Diego a ring, an anniversary gift presented early. Some accounts suggest she knew she would not see the actual date. Others describe her mood that night as unusually peaceful, even tender, as though some decision had already been made. The attending physician noted bronchopneumonia in the days preceding death. The official documents were signed. The newspapers printed their obituaries. And within hours, a kind of institutional silence descended upon the question of how, precisely, Frida Kahlo had left the world she had painted with such unflinching intimacy. Decades later, researchers would note the elevated levels of drugs in her system, the timing of her final diary entries, the testimony of those who had heard her speak openly of ending her suffering. Some biographers would use the word suicide. Others would invoke the possibility of assisted death, a final mercy administered by hands unknown, perhaps by Diego himself, perhaps by medical staff who understood that certain forms of compassion leave no documentation. None of this was investigated. None of this was confirmed. The Casa Azul simply absorbed another secret into its blue walls, as it had absorbed so many before. Within 4 years, Diego Rivera would deed the property to the Mexican nation. The bedroom where Frida died would become a museum exhibit. The bed, the wheelchair, the corsets, the pain, all of it preserved, arranged, and open to the public. What had been a site of private agony became a monument. What had been a death became a brand. But before the museum, before the cremation, before the final diary entry and the ring given too early, before the pulmonary embolism that may or may not have told the whole truth, there was a life, a family, a house that was blue before it was famous. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. The house existed before the myth. It stood at the corner of Londres and Allende streets in the village of Coyoacán, for it was still a village then, not yet absorbed into the sprawl of Mexico City. A modest colonial structure of thick adobe walls and interior courtyards, built in the early years of the 20th century. The year was 1904. The builder was a German immigrant who had arrived in Mexico 2 decades earlier, fleeing a past he rarely discussed and carrying a new name he had chosen for himself. Guillermo Kahlo had been born Karl Wilhelm Kahlo in Pforzheim, Baden, in 1871. The details of his departure from Germany remained deliberately obscured throughout his lifetime. Some accounts mention epilepsy, others suggest a family rupture, a first marriage that ended in death during childbirth, a temperament unsuited to the expectations of his merchant-class origins. What is certain is that he arrived in Mexico at 19, alone, with limited funds and no established connections. He worked first as a clerk, then as a cashier, drifting through the commercial margins of Porfirian Mexico. His transformation began when he acquired a camera. Photography in the 1890s was still a craft requiring patience, technical precision, and a particular eye for light, qualities that suited the reserved, meticulous young German. By the turn of the century, he had established himself as an architectural photographer of growing reputation. In 1904, the government of Porfirio Diaz commissioned him to document the nation's colonial heritage, churches, haciendas, public buildings, a project that would occupy him for years and provide the financial foundation for the house in Coyoacán. He had remarried by then. His second wife was Matilde Calderón y González, a woman of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, daughter of a photographer herself, raised in the strict observances of Mexican Catholicism. The marriage was functional rather than passionate. Matilde bore him 4 daughters in quick succession: Matilde, Adriana, Frida, and Cristina. The household operated according to the rigid hierarchies of the era, Guillermo retreating to his darkroom and his books, Matilde managing the domestic sphere with an efficiency that bordered on coldness. The house Guillermo built reflected his nature. It was practical, symmetrical, inward-facing. The original structure was more austere than what it would later become. No bright colors yet, no exuberant gardens, no folk art crowding every surface. That transformation would come later, when the house passed into other hands, other visions. In those early years, Casa Azul was simply a respectable residence for a respectable immigrant family, decorated in the European style Guillermo preferred, filled with books in German and the chemical smell of photographic development. Into this environment, on July 6, 1907, Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderón was born. She would later claim her birth year as 1910, aligning herself symbolically with the Mexican Revolution, an early indication of her instinct for self-mythology. But the church records are clear. She entered the world 3 years before the revolution began, in a house that still bore no particular significance beyond the private hopes and disappointments of its inhabitants. Her childhood was shaped by distances. The distance between her parents, whose emotional estrangement was evident to all their children. The distance between herself and her mother, whom she would describe in later years with language that verged on contempt. She did not know how to read or write, she only knew how to count money. The distance between the world inside the blue walls and the world beyond, where Mexico was tearing itself apart in a decade of revolutionary violence. But the defining distance was internal. At age 6, Frida contracted polio. The disease attacked her right leg, leaving it withered and shortened, noticeably thinner than the left. She spent 9 months confined to her room in the Casa Azul, watching the courtyard through her window, listening to the sounds of her sisters playing in spaces she could not reach. Guillermo, himself marked by illness, recognized something in his daughter's suffering. Of all his children, Frida became his companion, his project. He taught her to use his cameras, to develop photographs, to see the world through the mediating frame of a lens. He encouraged her physical rehabilitation with an intensity unusual for fathers of that era. Swimming, cycling, soccer, even wrestling. The leg would never fully recover. She would limp for the rest of her life. But something else had been established, a relationship to pain that was neither surrender nor denial, but a kind of negotiation. Suffering, she learned early, could be managed, accommodated, even transformed into a private source of identity. By adolescence, she had developed the persona that would carry her forward, sharp-tongued, theatrical, fiercely intelligent, deliberately provocative. She enrolled at the National Preparatory School in 1922, one of only 35 girls among 2,000 students. She joined a group of rebellious students who called themselves the Cachuchas. She read voraciously, argued politics, cultivated an image of bohemian independence. The leg was hidden beneath long skirts. The limp was absorbed into an exaggerated stride that she made her own. And then came the afternoon of September 17th, 1925. She was 18 years old, riding a wooden bus through the streets of Mexico City, returning home to Coyoacán with her boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Arias. The collision with an electric streetcar lasted only seconds. The bus splintered. An iron handrail pierced her abdomen and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her collarbone, her ribs, her right leg, the leg already weakened by polio, shattered. Her right foot was crushed, her shoulder dislocated. She was carried from the wreckage covered in blood and gold dust. A packet of powdered pigment, carried by another passenger, had burst open upon impact, coating her broken body in a strange, glittering shroud. They did not expect her to survive the night, but she survived. She returned to the Casa Azul, to the room where she had once lain with polio, and began the slow work of reconstructing a life from the wreckage of a body that would never again be whole. It was there, immobilized in bed, staring at her own reflection in a mirror her mother had mounted to the canopy above her, that she first began to paint. The paintings came slowly at first, born of necessity rather than ambition. Flat on her back in the Casa Azul, encased in plaster corsets that immobilized her fractured spine, Frida Kahlo had little else to occupy the hours. Her mother commissioned a specially designed easel that could be positioned over the bed. Her father supplied brushes and pigments. The mirror above showed her the only subject consistently available, herself. The early works were tentative, technically unschooled. She had never studied painting formally, had never intended to become an artist. But something in the practice answered a need that medicine could not address. The self-portraits that emerged from that period of convalescence were not exercises in vanity, but in documentation. A young woman examining her own altered form with the same clinical precision her father had brought to photographing colonial architecture. By 1928, She had recovered sufficiently to walk again, though never without pain, never without the knowledge that her body had been reassembled rather than healed. She was 21 years old. She had a small portfolio of paintings, and she had heard that Diego Rivera, the most famous artist in Mexico, was working on a mural at the Ministry of Public Education. The meeting has been recounted so many times, in so many variations, that separating fact from mutual mythology has become impossible. What is documented is this: Frida sought Diego out. She brought her paintings. She asked for his professional assessment. Diego, 42 years old, already twice divorced, physically enormous, and legendarily voracious in his appetites, descended from his scaffold and looked at what she had made. He recognized something. Whether it was talent, ambition, the particular intensity of her gaze, or some combination that defied easy categorization, he responded with the directness that characterized all his interactions. The paintings were good. She should continue. He would visit the Casa Azul to see more of her work. He came. He kept coming. Within a year, despite the objections of Frida's mother, who reportedly called Diego a fat old man, they were married. The wedding took place on August 21st, 1929, in the town hall of Coyoacán. Frida wore a traditional Tehuana dress, borrowed from her maid. Diego wore his usual disheveled suit. Guillermo Kahlo, when asked about the union, offered a resigned assessment that would prove prescient. "She is a devil," he said, "and he is another devil. At least they will be devils together." What followed was not a conventional marriage by any measure. Diego's infidelities were constant, flagrant, and entirely unrepentant. Frida responded first with anguish, then with retaliations of her own. Affairs with men and women, some conducted discreetly, others designed explicitly to wound. The relationship operated according to rules that only they fully understood, a continuous negotiation between devotion and betrayal, creative partnership, and emotional devastation. But if the marriage was turbulent, it was also productive. Diego's international reputation opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a young female painter working in an idiom that defied easy classification. Through Diego, Frida met the Surrealists, though she rejected their label. Through Diego, she traveled to San Francisco, Detroit, New York, cities where her small, intensely personal canvases attracted attention precisely because they were so different from her husband's monumental public works. Her fame grew incrementally, then accelerated. André Breton, arriving in Mexico in 1938, declared her a surrealist, whether she wished to be one or not. That same year, she held her first solo exhibition in New York, at the Julian Levy Gallery. The paintings sold. The critics took notice. Vogue photographed her. She was no longer merely Diego Rivera's wife. She was becoming Frida Kahlo, a figure of independent significance. The Casa Azul transformed alongside her. After Guillermo Kahlo's death in 1941, the house passed fully into Frida's possession. She and Diego, who had divorced in 1939 and remarried in 1940, a sequence of events as bewildering to their contemporaries as it remains to historians, began reshaping the property to reflect their shared aesthetic vision. Walls were painted in brilliant blues and yellows. The gardens expanded, populated with pre-Columbian sculptures, native plants, spider monkeys, parrots, hairless Mexican dogs. The interior filled with folk art, political artifacts, images of Marx and Lenin and Stalin, alongside Catholic iconography and indigenous crafts. The house became a statement, a stage set, a manifesto in architectural form. It announced its inhabitants' allegiances to Mexican identity, to revolutionary politics, to a vision of art that rejected European academicism in favor of something rooted in local soil. Visitors from around the world came to the Casa Azul: artists, intellectuals, political exiles. Leon Trotsky himself lived there for 2 years, a guest of Diego and Frida, before his assassination in 1940. From the outside, these years appeared triumphant. Frida's work hung in major collections. She received a teaching position at the Ministry of Public Education's School of Painting and Sculpture. She was celebrated, photographed, interviewed, desired. But beneath the performance, the body continued its slow betrayal. The spinal fractures had never properly healed. The infections returned, one after another. The pain required increasing quantities of morphine, of alcohol, of whatever substance might provide temporary relief. By the mid-1940s, she was wearing steel corsets to hold her spine in alignment. She painted them too, decorated them with imagery that transformed medical apparatus into art objects, as though by aestheticizing her constraints, she might somehow master them. The operations multiplied: bone grafts, spinal fusions, procedures that promised improvement and delivered only new complications. She spent months at a time hospitalized, painting from her bed as she had in those first years after the accident, watching her own reflection in mirrors that showed a woman aging faster than her years, held together by metal and will and something darker that her diary entries only hinted at. Diego watched as well. Whatever his failures as a husband, he understood what was happening. He saw the trajectory, and he said nothing, or nothing that survives in the record, about how this story might eventually end. The house on Londres Street, bright and defiant, filled with color and political conviction, had become something else beneath its painted surfaces. It had become a place where suffering was both hidden and displayed, where the distinction between living and performing had collapsed entirely, where a woman was slowly being consumed by a body she had never been able to trust. The house that Guillermo Kahlo built bore little resemblance to the house that Frida Kahlo would leave behind. The transformation was gradual, accumulating over decades, each alteration a form of autobiography, written in plaster and pigment, and carefully arranged objects. To understand the Casa Azul as it existed in Frida's final years is to understand how a building can become a body, how walls can serve as skin, how a private residence can be converted into a three-dimensional self-portrait. The original structure was conventional in its layout, rooms arranged around a central courtyard in the Spanish colonial manner, built for function rather than spectacle. Guillermo had added his studio, his darkroom, spaces organized around the practical requirements of his photographic work. The aesthetic was European, restrained, appropriate to a German immigrant who had never fully surrendered his continental sensibilities despite 4 decades in Mexico. Frida's interventions began modestly. After returning from the United States in 1934, estranged from Diego following his affair with her younger sister Cristina, she started acquiring the objects that would eventually crowd every surface of the house: pre-Columbian figurines, ceramic trees of life from Metepec, painted wooden animals from Oaxaca, retablos, small devotional paintings on tin, typically depicting miraculous interventions by saints. She bought them compulsively, arranged them obsessively, creating assemblages that blurred the boundaries between collection and installation. The color came later. The exterior walls, originally an unremarkable earth tone, were painted the intense cobalt blue that would give the house its name. The precise date of this transformation is undocumented, but by the early 1940s, the blue had become the house's defining feature, visible from the street, unmistakable, announcing that something unusual existed within. Other colors followed: window frames in bright yellow, interior walls in terracotta, in green, in deeper shades of blue. The palette was deliberately Mexican, consciously political, a rejection of the muted European tones that had characterized her father's era. Diego contributed his own impositions. In 1946, he commissioned the construction of a new wing, the pyramid-shaped structure that would house his collection of pre-Columbian artifacts, objects he had been acquiring for decades with the same obsessive energy Frida brought to her folk art. The addition was architecturally incongruous, a stepped stone form rising from the garden, like a fragment of Teotihuacan transplanted into suburban Coyoacan. It declared, in the most literal terms possible, the couple's identification with Mexico's indigenous past, their claim to an identity that preceded conquest and colonization. But the most significant alterations were not visible from outside. They occurred in Frida's bedroom, in her studio, in the spaces where she actually lived and worked during the years when leaving the house became increasingly difficult. The four-poster bed, canopied and curtained, was positioned to face a window overlooking the garden. The mirror that had been mounted above her during her first convalescence was reinstalled, allowing her to paint self-portraits even when she could not sit upright. A wheelchair, and later, after the amputation, a prosthetic leg, became permanent fixtures, integrated into the room's arrangement as naturally as furniture. The studio adjoined the bedroom, accessible without navigating stairs. Here she kept her pigments, her brushes, the small canvases she preferred to the monumental scale Diego favored. The walls displayed photographs, political posters, images of those she loved and those she admired. A portrait of Stalin hung near a photograph of her father. The juxtapositions were deliberate, curated, designed to communicate allegiances that were simultaneously personal and ideological. Every surface told a story. The kitchen, with its walls of yellow tile and blue trim, displayed the names Diego and Frida, spelled out in small ceramic cups mounted near the ceiling. The dining room held a long wooden table where guests gathered for meals that Frida orchestrated even when she was too ill to eat. The courtyard garden grew dense with the tropical plants, with the cages of her beloved animals, with the pre-Columbian sculptures Diego had placed among the foliage, like artifacts from some undiscovered archaeological site. The house became, in effect, a total work of art, what the Germans call a Gesamtkunstwerk. It was impossible to separate the architecture from the decoration from the biography from the mythology that Frida constructed around herself with the same intensity she brought to her paintings. The Tehuana dresses she wore, the elaborate hairstyles incorporating flowers and ribbons, the jewelry that combined pre-Columbian jade with colonial silver, all of this was continuous with the house, part of a single aesthetic project that encompassed everything she touched. Visitors understood they were entering a performance. The photographers who came to document her, Nicolas Murray, Lola Alvarez Bravo, Giselle Freund, captured images that were as carefully composed as any painted canvas. Frida positioned herself within her environment, using the house as backdrop and prop, understanding instinctively that the setting authenticated the persona. She was not merely a woman who lived in the Casa Azul, she was the Casa Azul made flesh, and the house was Frida rendered in architecture. But there was something else accumulating in those rooms, something the photographs could not fully capture. The medical equipment multiplied alongside the folk art. Bottles of medication lined the shelves near the ceramic figurines. The orthopedic corsets, more than 25 of them over the years, some plaster, some leather, some steel, hung in closets like costumes for a play about suffering. The house that celebrated Mexican identity and revolutionary politics was also a house organized around illness, around the management of a body in continuous decline. By the early 1950s, the Casa Azul had become both museum and hospital, shrine and sick room. Frida rarely left its walls. The world came to her instead. Students, journalists, political figures, old friends who climbed the stairs to her bedroom and sat beside the canopied bed where she held court like a dying empress. The house contained everything she needed and everything she could no longer escape. It was refuge and prison simultaneously, the physical manifestation of a life that had become inseparable from its own representation. The blue walls held their silence. They had witnessed the construction of a legend. Soon they would witness its conclusion. The final year of Frida Kahlo's life unfolded with a terrible momentum, each month bringing new deterioration, each medical intervention yielding diminishing returns. To reconstruct the sequence of events that led to the night of July 13th, 1954, is to trace a path that seemed, to those who walked it alongside her, to lead toward only one possible destination. The amputation occurred in August of 1953. Gangrene had developed in the right leg, the leg withered by polio, shattered in the bus accident, subjected to countless surgical attempts at repair over nearly 3 decades. The doctors presented the choice starkly: amputation or death by systemic infection. Frida resisted for months, understanding perhaps that this removal would constitute a final surrender, an acknowledgement that her body had definitively won its long war against her will. But by late summer, there was no alternative. The leg was removed below the knee. Her diary entries from this period survive. They are fragmentary, increasingly difficult to decipher, the handwriting of someone writing through pain and pharmaceutical haze. "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" she wrote in a passage that has been reproduced countless times, interpreted as evidence of transcendent acceptance. But other entries from the same months tell a different story. She wrote of amputation as mutilation. She drew images of her own body fractured, bleeding, incomplete. She used the word suicide without elaboration, leaving it suspended on the page like an unanswered question. The months following the surgery brought no improvement. She was fitted with a prosthetic leg, learned to walk with it after a fashion, even appeared publicly at a gallery opening in April 1954, her final exhibition in Mexico during her lifetime. Photographs from that evening show her arriving by ambulance, transported directly to a bed that had been installed in the gallery so she could receive visitors without standing. She wore her Tijuana dress, her silver jewelry, her carefully arranged hair. The performance continued, even as the performer was visibly failing. But privately, the situation had become untenable. The pain required morphine in quantities that alarmed her physicians. She developed infections, pneumonias, complications that kept her bedridden for weeks at a time. Her weight dropped. Her lucidity fluctuated. Those who visited the Casa Azul during this period described a woman oscillating between determined vitality and profound despair, sometimes within the same conversation. Diego Rivera maintained a complex presence throughout these final months. He had taken a separate studio, was engaged in his own work, was reportedly involved with other women as he had been throughout their marriage. Yet he also visited frequently, sat with her, attended to practical matters. The nature of their interactions during this period remains subject to interpretation. Some biographers describe tender reconciliation. Others suggest Diego was simply waiting, managing the inevitable with the same pragmatic detachment he brought to most emotional situations. The days immediately preceding July 13th can be reconstructed only partially. On July 2nd, against medical advice, Frida insisted on attending a political demonstration, a protest against the CIA-backed coup that had just overthrown the government of Guatemala. Photographs show her in a wheelchair, holding a banner, her face gaunt but determined. It was her final public appearance. Within days, she had developed bronchopneumonia. The week that followed was a descent. fever, difficulty breathing, increasing reliance on medication to manage both the infection and the underlying chronic pain. Dr. Velasco y Polo attended her daily, later describing a patient who understood her condition clearly, who spoke of death with what he characterized as unusual calmness. On the evening of July 13th, according to accounts gathered afterward, Frida asked to see Diego. He came. She gave him the ring, an anniversary gift, their silver wedding anniversary still weeks away. The gesture was noted by those present, interpreted variously as sentimentality, premonition, or something more deliberate. Diego would later describe her mood that night as peaceful, though his accounts of this period shifted over the years, details appearing and disappearing as he retold the story. She slept, or she appeared to sleep. The nurses checked on her periodically through the night. At some point in the early morning hours of July 14th, her breathing changed, then stopped. When Dr. Velasco y Polo was summoned, he found no pulse. He recorded the time of death as 6:30 in the morning and attributed the cause to pulmonary embolism. The official narrative established itself quickly. A blood clot, originating perhaps in the circulatory complications of her many surgeries, had traveled to her lungs and terminated her life. It was medically plausible. It was consistent with her documented conditions. It required no further investigation. Yet the irregularities began almost immediately. Diego Rivera declined to authorize an autopsy, a decision within his rights as her husband, but one that foreclosed any possibility of independent medical verification. The body was taken to the Palace of Fine Arts, where it lay in state for public viewing, then transported to the crematorium that same evening. Within 24 hours of her death, Frida Kahlo had been reduced to ashes, all physical evidence of her final hours permanently destroyed. Those who had been present at the Casa Azul that night offered accounts that did not entirely align. Some described Frida as having been in relatively stable condition the previous evening. Others mentioned elevated doses of medication administered in her final hours. The nursing staff, the household servants, the family members who had passed through, their testimonies, gathered in the days and years that followed, contained discrepancies that no official inquiry ever attempted to resolve. And then there was the diary. The final entry, written in the days before her death, contained the words that would fuel decades of speculation. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida." Below the text, she had drawn a dark angel rising upward, away from the earth. Was this the reflection of a woman accepting natural death, finding peace in its approach? Or was it something else? A statement of intention, a farewell written by someone who had already decided how her story would end. The cremation had made certainty impossible. Whatever the truth of that final night, it had been converted to ash and placed in a clay urn, beyond the reach of investigation. Part 6. Contradictions and Silence. In the immediate aftermath of Frida Kahlo's death, the machinery of mourning operated with remarkable efficiency. The public narrative consolidated before questions could gather sufficient force to disrupt it. A great artist had succumbed to a lifetime of medical suffering. The nation grieved. The body was cremated. The story, it seemed, was complete. But stories have a way of resisting completion, particularly when those closest to the events offer testimony that fails to cohere. In the months and years that followed July 1954, the accounts of Frida's final hours began to diverge in ways that demanded attention, even as the institutional structures that might have investigated chose silence instead. Diego Rivera's statements constitute the most significant source of contradiction. In the period immediately following Frida's death, he said little publicly, performing the role of grieving husband with characteristic theatricality. But as years passed, his version of events shifted. In his autobiography, published posthumously, he wrote with apparent candor about Frida's final night, describing her gift of the ring, her peaceful demeanor, his own sense that she was saying goodbye. More troubling, he made reference to her having killed herself, a phrase that appeared without elaboration or context, dropped into the text, and never explained. Was this a confession, a figure of speech, the careless language of an aging man whose relationship with truth had always been flexible? Diego Rivera was a notorious fabulist, a man who invented episodes of his own biography with the same creative freedom he brought to his murals. His statements could not be taken at face value, but neither could they be entirely dismissed. The medical attendants present during Frida's final days offered their own fragmentary accounts. Dr. Velasco Ipolo maintained throughout his life that the death was natural, consistent with the documented pulmonary embolism. Yet he also acknowledged that Frida had spoken openly about wanting to end her suffering, that she had asked questions about lethal doses of medication, that her final weeks had been marked by a determination he found difficult to characterize. He never accused anyone of assisting her death. He also never entirely foreclosed the possibility. The nursing staff, interviewed by biographers in subsequent decades, provided details that complicated the official timeline. Some recalled that Frida had been given medication on the night of July 13th in quantities that exceeded her usual dosage. Others mentioned that she had seemed unusually alert that evening, as though preparing for something, putting affairs in order. One nurse reportedly described finding empty medication bottles by the bedside in the morning, though this account was never corroborated, and the nurse in question later declined to repeat it on record. The absence of an autopsy became, over time, the central void around which speculation accumulated. Without toxicological analysis, without examination of the body by independent physicians, the official cause of death rested entirely on Dr. Velasco Ipolo's clinical judgment. His diagnosis was plausible. It was also unprovable. The rapid cremation, conducted within hours of the public viewing, before any family member or authority could request further examination, ensured that it would remain so permanently. Some who knew Frida intimately offered interpretations that stopped just short of explicit accusation. Her friend and sometime lover, the photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo, spoke in interviews of Frida's exhaustion, her readiness to die, her expressed wish that the end would come quickly. Alvarez Bravo never claimed direct knowledge of how that end was achieved, but her phrasing suggested a woman who had made peace with death in terms that implied agency rather than mere acceptance. The diary entries presented their own interpretive challenges. Frida had kept journals throughout her adult life, filling them with drawings, confessions, fragments of poetry, expressions of pain, both physical and emotional. The final pages, written in the weeks before her death, contained passages that could be read as suicidal ideation, or simply as the reflections of someone confronting mortality with characteristic honesty. "I hope the exit is joyful" might be a farewell. It might equally be the observation of a woman who knew death was approaching regardless of her own intentions. Biographers who examined the diaries noted something else. Certain pages appeared to have been removed. The binding showed evidence of excision. What those missing pages contained, who removed them, and when, these questions entered the record without answers. Diego Rivera had possession of the diaries after Frida's death. He controlled access to them for years. Whether he edited them to protect her reputation, to protect his own, or for reasons that can no longer be determined, the documentary record that survived was a documentary record that had been curated. The institutional silence extended beyond the family. Mexican authorities conducted no investigation into the circumstances of the death. The medical establishment accepted the official cause without challenge. The art world, focused on preserving and promoting Frida's legacy, showed no appetite for inquiries that might complicate the emerging mythology. Within a few years, the question of how Frida Kahlo died had been largely subsumed by the question of what she had meant, her significance as an artist, as a symbol, as a cultural icon. The manner of her death became a footnote to the fact of her life, yet the questions persisted in the margins, surfacing periodically as new biographers examined old evidence, as witnesses aged and sometimes spoke more freely, as the passage of time loosened constraints that had once enforced discretion. By the 1980s and 90s, serious scholars were openly discussing the possibility of suicide, of assisted death, of a final act of autonomy by a woman whose body had denied her autonomy for decades. No consensus emerged. The evidence that existed was circumstantial, contradictory, filtered through memories that had been shaped by subsequent events and loyalties. The evidence that might have been definitive, the physical body itself, the complete and unedited diaries, the testimony of those who were actually present in the room when breathing stopped, had been destroyed, redacted, or carried to graves of their own. What remained was the Casa Azul itself, its blue walls holding whatever secrets had transpired within them, offering no testimony that investigation could extract. The cremation took place on the evening of July 14, 1954, at the Civil Crematorium of Dolores in Mexico City. Those who witnessed it would later describe the scene with a strange, almost hallucinatory vividness. Diego Rivera standing before the open furnace as the body entered the flames, watching as the heat caused Frida's remains to shift, her hair momentarily igniting in a halo of fire, her lips appearing to form a smile as the muscles contracted. Whether this account is accurate or apocryphal, it entered the mythology immediately, another layer of performance adhering to a life that had never distinguished clearly between the authentic and the staged. Diego collected the ashes himself. He placed them in a pre-Columbian vessel, a ceramic piece shaped like a seated figure, which he installed in Frida's bedroom at the Casa Azul. The room remained largely as she had left it. The canopied bed, the wheelchair, the medical equipment, the butterflies pinned to the headboard, the photographs and paintings that had surrounded her during her final years. It was already less a private space than a shrine, awaiting only official designation to complete its transformation. The 3 years that followed Frida's death marked Diego Rivera's own decline. He was 67 years old in 1954, his health compromised by decades of excess, his artistic production slowing, though never entirely ceasing. He remarried within a year of Frida's death. His fourth wife, Emma Hurtado, had been his art dealer. The union was practical, a matter of companionship and estate management rather than passion. Those who knew him described a man diminished, still capable of public performance, but privately haunted by losses he could not articulate. He spoke of Frida constantly. In interviews and conversations, in the autobiography he dictated during his final years, she remained the central figure, more present in death than many of the living women who continued to pass through his life. His accounts of their marriage grew increasingly romantic, the infidelities and cruelties softened by retrospective sentiment. He claimed that the day he married her was the happiest of his life, that losing her was the most devastating blow he had ever suffered. Whether this represented genuine feeling or the construction of a legacy convenient to his own mythology remains, like so much else, impossible to determine. In 1957, Diego made the decision that would determine the Casa Azul's future. He announced his intention to donate the house and its contents to the Mexican people, to be administered as a museum dedicated to Frida's memory. The gift included everything: the art collection, the folk objects, the personal effects, the pre-Columbian pieces, the building itself. It was an act of extraordinary generosity, or perhaps of calculated image-making, or perhaps simply the gesture of a dying man seeking to ensure that something would survive him. He did not live to see the museum open. On November 24, 1957, Diego Rivera died of heart failure in his studio in San Angel, the separate residence he had maintained throughout his marriage to Frida. He was 70 years old. His body, unlike Frida's, was not cremated. It lay in state at the Palace of Fine Arts, as hers had before burial at the Rotonda de las Personas Ilustres, the official cemetery for Mexico's distinguished citizens. His wish to have his ashes mingled with Frida's, expressed in various documents and statements, was not honored. They remained separate in death, as they had so often been in life. The Museo Frida Kahlo opened its doors in 1958, 1 year after Diego's death. The Casa Azul became officially a public institution, its rooms preserved as period installations, its gardens maintained, its walls repainted in that distinctive blue whenever weathering required restoration. Visitors could walk through the spaces where Frida had lived and worked, could view her paintings and possessions, could stand in the courtyard where she had posed for photographers and imagine themselves inhabiting her world. But something else happened during the museum's preparation, something that would not become public knowledge for nearly 50 years. Before the house opened to visitors, a bathroom adjacent to Frida's bedroom was sealed. The door was locked, reportedly on Diego's instructions, with orders that it remain unopened for at least 15 years after his death. The room contained personal items, clothing, letters, documents, medical records, photographs, materials deemed too intimate or too revealing for immediate public exposure. 15 years passed, then 20, then 30. The bathroom remained sealed, its contents unknown, its existence largely forgotten by all but a few museum administrators who understood that something lay hidden within the walls of the institution they managed. The Casa Azul presented itself as a complete record of Frida Kahlo's life, while concealing a repository of evidence that might complicate or clarify the narratives that had been constructed around her. The world beyond the blue walls continued without pause. Frida's reputation, modest at the time of her death relative to Diego's towering fame, began its slow ascent. Her paintings entered major collections. Her image appeared on products, on magazine covers, on the bodies of those who tattooed her face onto their skin. The woman who had spent so much of her life confined to a single house became, paradoxically, omnipresent. Her eyebrows, her flowers, her stare recognizable to millions who had never seen her actual paintings. The Casa Azul absorbed this transformation, becoming not merely a museum, but a pilgrimage site, a destination for those seeking connection with a figure who had transcended the category of artist to become something closer to secular saint. The rooms filled with visitors speaking dozens of languages, photographing the bed where she had suffered, the kitchen where she had prepared elaborate meals, the garden where her ashes rested in their ceramic vessel, and behind the sealed door, the unseen materials waited. Part 8. The Estate After. For nearly half a century, the sealed bathroom kept its silence. Visitors to the Museo Frida Kahlo passed within meters of the locked door without knowing it existed, their attention directed toward the public rooms that had been carefully arranged to tell a particular story. The curators maintained the space as Diego had left it, preserving not only the objects, but the omissions, the deliberate gaps in the archive that his final instructions had created. Then, in 2004, 50 years after Frida's death, nearly 50 after Diego's, the decision was made to open the room. What emerged from behind that door was staggering in its volume and intimacy. More than 22,000 documents, 6,000 photographs, hundreds of articles of clothing, including the elaborate Tehuana dresses that had become inseparable from Frida's image. Medical records detailing procedures never previously documented. Letters from lovers whose relationships had been subjects of speculation but never confirmation. Drawings, diaries, personal effects that had been sealed away from scholars and public alike for 2 generations. The discovery forced a reconsideration of everything that had been written about Frida Kahlo in the intervening decades. Biographers had constructed narratives based on incomplete evidence, filling gaps with inference and interpretation. Now, suddenly, primary sources existed that could confirm or contradict those constructions. The orthopedic corsets she had worn, decorated with painted imagery, communist symbols, images of fetuses and fractured spines, emerged as artworks in their own right, objects that blurred the boundary between medical device and creative expression. Photographs documented moments and relationships that had previously existed only in rumor. The museum announced the discovery carefully, aware of its implications. Exhibitions were organized to display selections from the newly available materials. Scholars received access, under controlled conditions, to documents that had been hidden for half a century. The sealed bathroom became, retroactively, one of the most significant archival discoveries in the history of Latin American art. But questions accompanied the revelation. Why had Diego ordered these materials concealed? What had he sought to protect? Frida's privacy, his own reputation, the carefully constructed mythology that served both their legacies. Some of the discovered documents touched on matters that might have complicated the public narrative. Evidence of the depth of Frida's pharmaceutical dependence, correspondence that illuminated the more destructive aspects of her marriage, materials that suggested the extent to which her public persona had been a deliberate performance rather than an authentic expression. The opening of the bathroom coincided with a phenomenon that had been building for decades: the transformation of Frida Kahlo from historical figure into global brand. By the early 2000s, her image had achieved a saturation that would have been unimaginable during her lifetime. Her face appeared on handbags, refrigerator magnets, T-shirts, vodka bottles. The unibrow and the flowers had become visual shorthand for a complex of ideas: female resilience, artistic authenticity, Mexican identity, suffering transformed into beauty, that could be purchased, worn, and displayed without any necessary engagement with the actual paintings that had been her life's work. The Casa Azul stood at the center of this commercial apotheosis. Visitor numbers climbed year after year, eventually exceeding 400,000 annually, making it one of the most visited museums in Mexico. Lines formed around the block. Tour buses disgorged groups who moved through the rooms with smartphones raised, capturing images to prove they had been present in this sacred space. The gift shop expanded, offering merchandise that allowed visitors to take pieces of the Frida mythology home with them: tote bags, earrings, journals, replicas of her jewelry, dolls bearing her likeness. The house itself remained largely unchanged in its physical arrangement, yet its meaning had shifted fundamentally. What had been a private residence, then a memorial, had become a pilgrimage site and tourist attraction simultaneously. The intimacy that Frida had cultivated so carefully, the sense that her art and her environment and her body were continuous with one another, had been replaced by the distancing mechanisms of institutional display. Velvet ropes prevented visitors from touching the bed where she had suffered. Glass cases protected the objects she had once handled daily. The experience of the Casa Azul was now an experience of looking at representations of a life rather than inhabiting the spaces where that life had actually occurred. Some critics noted the irony. Frida had been, during her lifetime, deeply skeptical of the art market, of the commodification of creative work, of the systems that transformed paintings into investments and artists into celebrities. She had aligned herself with communist politics, had painted images that challenged bourgeois sensibilities, had crafted a persona that positioned her as an outsider to the establishment she nonetheless cultivated. Now her childhood home operated according to the logic of cultural tourism, generating revenue, attracting sponsorships, participating in the global economy of heritage and memory. Others defended the museum's evolution as a necessary adaptation to contemporary realities. Without visitors, without income, without public engagement, the Casa Azul could not be maintained. The alternative to commercialization was deterioration, the slow decay that had claimed so many historical properties whose significance failed to translate into sustainable funding. The gift shop merchandise, however vulgar, subsidized the conservation of the actual artifacts. The crowds, however disruptive to contemplative experience, ensured that Frida Kahlo's work remained visible to audiences who might never enter a traditional art museum. The house absorbed these contradictions as it had absorbed so many others. It stood on its corner in Coyoacan, blue walls bright against the exhaust gray air of modern Mexico City, receiving its daily procession of visitors who came seeking something: connection, inspiration, the frisson of proximity to suffering and genius that the carefully preserved rooms might or might not provide. The bed remained made. The wheelchair remained positioned. The ashes remained in their ceramic vessel, displayed behind glass in the room where Frida had died and been transformed into legend. Whatever had actually happened on the night of July 13th, 1954, the house had long since ceased to be a site of investigation. It had become, instead, a site of veneration, and veneration, by its nature, prefers mystery to resolution. The blue walls remain. They have witnessed nearly 120 years of history now. The German immigrant building his modest home, the child contracting polio in a back bedroom, the young woman returning shattered from a bus accident that should have killed her, the artist constructing a mythology powerful enough to outlast her own body.